right. It is time according to the clock on the wall. And I have it on pretty good authority that clock is right, because it's like a nuclear clock or something. So nuclear. So, but either way, we're gonna go by that clock. So it's good to see everybody here this morning. We've got a pretty good run of stuff to talk about this morning. Before we begin, let's go to God in prayer. God, we are so thankful to you for the time that you've blessed us with, the time that we can assemble here and study from your word. May the things that we discuss here this morning be in accordance with your will. And may we glean some truths from what we're studying here that we may apply to make us better Christians. In Christ's name, amen. So we are on chapter 21 of Genesis today. The big news of chapter 21 is the day has finally arrived. And what do I mean by that? In verse 1, we begin, and the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. What had he spoken about? What had God been talking about all this time? There you go. The child of promise. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. How long had this been going on? Probably about 25 years. About 25 years this has been, more or less. This has been going on, and finally it gets here today. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Now Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born to him. Just to put this into perspective, Abraham was 100 now. How old will Isaac be when Abraham dies? That's kind of a jump ahead question, but it just kind of popped into my head. I thought it was kind of a perspective thing that might work good. How old was Abraham when he died? Anybody remember? Was it some 175 years old? So Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old. Now, I know it's going to take a minute for your brain to kind of wrap around all that stuff, right? And then he lived to see, Abraham lived to see his son up to the time he was 75. So that's a pretty long stretch, isn't it? And this chapter here that we're dealing with actually is good. There's a number of, there's several years that is actually going to pass in just a short time in this chapter. So moving along, and Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne him a son in his old age. Abraham and Sarah laughed at the prospect of having children at their age, didn't they? On several occasions. We know that Abraham had laughed about it, and it was from what we read about that, it was almost, you know, how we talk about somebody gets to laughing so hard they roll all around on the ground about it. And that was the picture I had envisioned in my mind with Abraham when God was talking to him and told him he was going to have a son. Tony?
Would that be laughter of joy, maybe? Not saying, you know, I don't believe you or whatever.
I think initially,
I thought that too.
I think it was a.
About it now, maybe it could have been just.
I think at least in part, it was a. Really? You really telling me this? Unbelievable. It's so, because of their age. Sarah was, you know, as the Bible says, was past her childbearing age. So it was kind of a natural reaction, I guess, really, to laugh about that.
This day and time, can we say that same as some woman would have a baby when they were 50?
Yeah.
About the same thing, right?
I think that's a fair statement. I think that is, yeah.
Abraham was 60 or whatever.
Yeah. I think that is a very good way to look at that, comparatively speaking. Zane?
This is just curiosity. I'd just like to know what Jesus laughed about. You know, I'd just like to see some things that he actually laughed at.
Well, that might be a good study sometime.
Just see what his humor was all about. You know,
'Cause,
just find his
you know,
personality. Everybody has a different personality.
Sure they do. And you know, Jesus experienced all of the things that we did. The Bible tells us that. So, you know, all of the emotions. So yeah, he had to do that. And we know God would do the same things, because where do we get that? All of the emotions that we have, we get them from God. We're created in His image. So, but yeah, that's a good point, Zane. That'd be something good to talk about. So we see here, Sarah's pretty excited now, isn't she? She said, you know, I laughed about that, and God's making me laugh now. Now this laugh is going to be laughter of joy, great joy. And everybody's going to laugh with me instead of laughing at me. It was a big deal back in that time to give the patriarch of a family children, especially male children. That was to give them a son. That was considered their lineage. So that was an important thing, and that was it was a big deal, and I'm sure Sarah had. It bothered her a lot that she was unable to do that, to give Abraham a son. And I think it was a matter of they heard what God said, but maybe it just hadn't really sunk in exactly what he said before. But now it has. So the child grew and was weaned. Now, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Does anybody know when that typically occurred? usually at about 3 years old. And I'm pretty sure that I'm gonna guess that the happiest person in the room was probably Sarah. So, and it was a time to make a big deal out of it. It was cause for great celebration. You know, part of that, I think, in part, they didn't have the modern medicine and all of the things that we have now. So, to get a child to that age, even at that time, may have been a big deal. I think the infant mortality rate was probably considerably greater than it is now. So there was time for great rejoicing. And Abraham threw a feast. Everybody was there. You know, all the family, even the outlaw family. And that's when the trouble started. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. You may say that Ishmael was mocking Isaac. It's not known exactly what went on, whether there was some sort of physical confrontation, whether it was just psychological or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, Ishmael was, I think the King James version puts it that he was mocking Isaac. I think through a discussion of that, I think it was. You might even use the word bullying with that. Perhaps playing rough, persecuted. At least that was in the New Testament when Paul talked about that in Galatians 4:29. Paul understood the passage to mean that Ishmael persecuted Isaac, which we could use in our modern day vernacular as bullying, couldn't we? No, at this point in time, at the time that Isaac was 3 years old to be weaned, Ishmael would have been about 16 or 17. So he'd be a teenager. He's a big old stropping young.
So a 16-year-old boy, man,
Yeah.
mocking a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
He could have been called little mama's boy, and you're telling him, that there's not much you can mock about a 3-year-old baby.
Yeah. I think it ran probably deeper. For a long time, until Ishmael was, 13, 14 years old, he was the son. He was the son of Abraham. And that carried with it quite a lot of blessings. Clout. Steve?
When she talks about Ishmael, she doesn't refer to him as his son. It's always the maid son, her son. She doesn't even name him.
Yeah. you know, that it's very possible that this kid's had to live with this his whole life, too, isn't it? So, Zane?
That's still not quite, now Ishmael, I think last time I had asked you where he came from, where his descendants were, and I thought it was Cush, but I believe I'm wrong on that.
All right.
Cush was the descendants of Ham.
Now, yeah, but Ishmael is a direct descendant of Abraham
Right.
through Hagar, the handmaid.
Who did they become? That's what I'm trying. Isn't that the Palestinians?
They,
Isn't that who Ishmael is?
yeah, I'd have to look up and see exactly who his became. It was a he became a Gentile nation, of sorts at least, with probably very strong ties to Egypt. His mother was an Egyptian. And
King James says in verse 11, this thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son.
yep,
Talking about
What was that again? I'm sorry.
in verse 11, King James says, and the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son.
yeah, and we're gonna get to what was grievous in just a minute. But the fact is, we know something was going on with Ishmael, between Ishmael and Isaac. The full extent, we don't really know. The Bible's not clear on that. But I think there has always been this level of jealousy between Sarah and Hagar. Do you remember when Ishmael was first born?
She became jealous because she got pregnant when she didn't.
Exactly.
So then she wanted her sent away. Then the angel found her, told her to go back because they had plans.
Be in
for her.
subjection. Yep.
Well then, and I imagine now this ridicule from the older brother is because technically, even though he was Abraham's son, it was the son of the handmaiden, and this wife, Sarah, any child she bore was gonna be above him anyway.
Yeah. Well, the other you know, and as part of that too, is that in that ancient world, that way, of course, the handmaid would have a child, but it was expected that the handmaid's child was the child of the mistress and the head of the household. Because she did say when she put Abraham up to this, maybe I can have children through her. So,
Were those children treated like slaves? Did they have to go out about and work like the rest of the hired help or I don't know.
I imagine they did.
And I wonder if Ishmael had to work, or was he shown partiality and favoritism and didn't have to?
I imagine he had certain job duties he had to do. I think everybody had those. I mean, we're not talking about people having a life of ease at all. There were certain things you had to do to survive. You know, now Abraham was a very wealthy individual, and with that came a lot of responsibilities. So yeah, my guess would be Ishmael's gonna have to get out and do his part too, and he's big enough now he can do all that. The thing that I see here is that this contention that happened in the 9th verse didn't just all of a sudden show up. I don't think that was just an isolated incident. This tension has been growing since the Egyptian handmaid Hagar conceived and then bore Ishmael. And the one thing I can say to that is that's what happens when you don't do it the way God says. When you try to help God out, like we know better than God how to do, that's what happens. And we see the lesson over and over and over and over again in the Bible, how important it is to do things the way God sets forth. Steve?
Hagar probably started it because it says,
Yeah.
when she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight.
Yes, yes.
So Hagar,
She sure did her fair
started
share.
it, in a sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Because before that everything was good. Now then there's that. So
Yep. Tony?
Let's just back up just a little bit.
All right.
Chapter 12, God promises to make Abraham a great nation.
Yes, yes.
He didn't know exactly how that was going to happen, but he was promised that.
Yep.
And then Sarai came and says, "You can take my handmaid."
Mm-hmm.
Does that put a little dent in her faith, maybe? A little bit?
I think we probably see examples throughout this time between chapter 12 and now that there's a little bit of dented faith both with Sarai and Abram.
Yes.
I think we can see it in both. You got the times of, well, right out of the chute, what did he do? They went to Egypt, and Abram was like, hey, by the way, make sure that you tell them that you are my sister so that they won't kill me and take you. And then there were some other things along that line. Of course, we had with Abimelech very, very recently in here of the same type of thing. So,
Always talking about the faith of Abraham.
yeah,
That is true.
and it absolutely is.
They were not perfect in their faith.
And that's the point that's important for us to get. We can so easily look at Bible characters like Abraham and put them up on a pedestal that they are perfect. If we're not careful, that's what we'll do. The Israelites, over the years, basically had done that, had they not? Father Abraham was the man. He didn't do no wrong. He is Father Abraham. Well, we see, if you drew a graph of what Abraham's faith looked like from our perception of what we see here, the things that he did, it'd probably look kind of like an EKG, wouldn't it? Or the stock market. But the whole point is that it was a growing faith. And when we talk about the faith of Abraham, it is a growing faith. He didn't start off in chapter 12 with this high level of faith, did he? It had to grow. And the example there is the same as the way it works with us, isn't it? We don't come up out of that baptistry and have the faith of old Abraham, do we? We have the faith of a very young Abram. That's going to have some time to grow. And there's going to be some time of testing. And we're going to get to that in a couple of weeks about some testing.
Chapter 12 talks about faith coming by hearing and hearing by the word of God.
Yes, it does.
Study the Bible and all, the more faith you'll have.
That is the truth. So, what are some things like that? What does it take for our faith to increase? Well, to increase. Well, we know. All right. So we know knowledge. Knowledge is one. Application is another. And these trials that we go through tend to strengthen our faith, but that is also a part of, depends on our attitude. Our faith can either grow with a trial, or it can go away with a trial.
Faith by something when you really get out there to try to do something positive.
Yep.
And you're young and inexperienced, and you have a, as good as Judy says, a kerfuffle.
Yep.
You know, it can really discourage you.
You're absolutely right. It can be very discouraging, and that's one of the things. And that's kind of there's things that one thing kind of leads to another. And when we talk about how going through a trial can discourage us, but then we look and we see this family right here. How does that affect our faith? If we're doing it right, it should help, shouldn't it? We can encourage one another. The Bible teaches us to encourage and to admonish one another, doesn't it?
That's where you really get in trouble.
The admonishing part.
Admonishment.
It is. Sure is.
Believe me.
It sure is. It sure is to get us in trouble with that. And are we always going to do it right? No, not as long as we're in this human temple. We're not.
We'll see, though, the next chapter.
The next chapter is going to be,
Abraham
yeah.
stood the test.
He did. All right, so go ahead.
I said I've learned as much from their mistakes as I have from their positives, because it shows me that, hey, he did this and that guy did that and this guy did that and I've done that and I've done that. So
And
God just put those people in there and shows you through their failures how you can.
Zane, that is the beauty of the Bible.
Yes, sir.
The Bible shows us not just the good, does it? A lot of other, I'll call it religious writings, pretty much just give the good of their principal character, doesn't it? Not the Bible.
Facebook and Instagram, you got the highlight reels of people's lives.
So, the Bible gives us the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the whole point in all of that, everything in this book, the whole point of that is for our good. That we can learn from their mistakes. And we have the whole thing. It's like having, when there's a story that goes on here in the Bible, we have something they didn't have. In chapter 12, when God called Abram to leave where he was and go somewhere else, well, we know where he was going. We know what was going to happen. Abram didn't have that. He didn't have the knowledge that 25 or 30 years later he was going to have the son of promise. He didn't have all of the things we have with this. but we see his faith continued to grow. Now let's look at another test of Abraham's faith here for a minute. So we're at the point here where Ishmael is mocking Isaac. Well, Sarah didn't like that a little bit. She wasn't happy about that. That was her baby, and she was not having it. Therefore she said to Abraham, this is verse 10, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. The matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. Think about how Abraham must have felt with that. This, regardless of how he got here, Ishmael was still Abraham's son. He was still a son from his loins. Miss Barbara?
His free will got him in trouble.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it did.
But it's rough, he knows right from wrong, he knows he's his son, he's supposed to take care of it, provide for it, that's his duty as a father, and his woman's telling him,
I reckon that Abraham found out what happens when you have more than one wife. I reckon when God created Adam and Eve, he stopped there for a reason, didn't he?
She wasn't a wife, though.
Well,
She was a handmaid.
she was a handmaid, but in some of the words that are used, it was kind of implied that way as like a secondary wife type thing.
Well, I know, at one time, I don't know if it applies back then, but I know at one time, men were allowed to have, they had a wife, and they had several handmaidens. They were allowed to take a wife if it was okay with the first wife,
They were
but they were still, there were still wives and handmaidens. The only way they were actually a wife is if they married them.
they didn't have all of the full benefits, but they had a lot of benefit of being another wife. But the whole point to that is this. We see a lot of times in the Bible where there are multiple wives, specifically multiple wives, and we got to go back to Genesis, the 2nd chapter. One wife. I mean, it's
Solomon had like 1,200, didn't he? Better 1,200.
he had
800 and then 400.
he had 300 wives and 700 concubines. So, poor guy. That's all I can say. But he did it to himself. I mean, it's as simple as that. So, the whole point is when you're going to do things not according to the way God wants it done, there's going to be consequences, isn't there? There are. And, it's a good thing that God didn't just strike us all dead when we do something wrong, because there just wouldn't be anybody left. It just wouldn't happen. And we're allowed to practice free will, but there's consequences that come with that. It's as simple as that. But Abraham was very distressed. He was distressed that this contention was going on in his household. Abraham, if you look at his history through the years, has been one of trying to be a peacemaker. Isn't that what God wants his children to do? To be a peacemaker. Now, sometimes it didn't quite work out the way that Abraham did it. Sometimes it did. One of the ways that he was a peacemaker sometimes was to say, yeah, she's my sister. We don't want any trouble. Well, that really wasn't kind of the way God wanted that to be a peacemaker. But you see, one of the big things of when Abraham was a peacemaker was with Lot. When he told Lot, he said, Lot, you look out and you see where you want to go. We got to separate. Our herds are too great. There's a lot of contention here. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. You choose. And you know, we talked about how Abraham didn't have to do it that way. He had the right, as the patriarch, to say, all right, so here's how we're going to do this. You take your stuff and you go over here, and then I'm going to stay here where this is. That's not what he did. And we see that as kind of being the way that Abraham did. But God said to Abraham to go on and go ahead and do what Sarah says. Verse 12, but God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of the bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So there was a little bit of consolation there with Abraham. And God told him, don't fret over that. I've got this. I know how this is going to turn out. Yeah, he did. I'm going to take care of this one too. So Abraham relented. He said, okay, I'll do what God told me. So he rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, and he put it on her shoulder. He gave it and the boy, and he gave it and the boy to Hagar, and sent her away. And he departed, and she departed, and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba.
What was significant about the bread and water? I feel like I've read before that they treated her as he was a soldier in bread and water.
Well,
I
I think
figure out nothing. It was significant that he gave her bread and water.
well, that was one of the things that I think there's a couple things there. One is
And he didn't give her like donkeys with provisions and like send her with a little convoy, give her a little bit of a dowry on those. He just
I think that in his mind, as he sent her out with enough to get her going, and that she would find provisions along the way. I don't think that he would have thought that there was a reason to send her with several mule loads of stuff. Just to have just to have somebody come along and steal all of it. Perhaps even do harm to her and the boy.
He might have faith in Ishmael because he was already a hunter. He could take care of him.
And here's the other thing that we may be missing with this too. Perhaps this did show his faith in God. Did God not just say, I am going to make of him a great nation because he is your seed? So that means,
He told Abraham.
yeah, that's exactly what God told Abraham. So that in my mind would mean, well, God's going to take care of this. I'm going to give her enough stuff to get her going. I'm not going to make her a moving target, but I'm going to give her enough stuff to sustain her, and God's going to take care of her. God's going to take care of the rest.
That's just staple of life.
It is. It is a staple of life. And that's, we kind of look at bread and water as a punishment meal, but you're right, Mike. That is quite the staple. You try to get along without water and see how far that gets you. I can assure you that before it kills you, the doctor's going to be done got on to you because you ain't taking in enough. Ask me how I know that. And the bread was something that was easy to fix. They always kept that. That too was a staple. We've only got a couple of minutes. This was a good stopping point here, and then next week we'll pick up on Hagar and Ishmael's time in the wilderness, and God actually talking to her and letting her know what's going on as well. So yeah, there was a lot of time went by here, wasn't there? I think I am now. All right, thank y'all for being here this morning. We'll pick up next week.